Howdy y'all, welcome back and namaste. I want to zoom out here and help you see the bigger picture of what I'm trying to paint for you. Now we're still in chapter 4 of this philosophical quest, which is called Setting Course, InterCourse, DisCourse, and Death. Setting course is what you do when you pick your goal, right? Your destination. Once you know where you're trying to go, once you know where you're heading, then you set course, or you set your heading towards that goal. Now most people, especially when they're young, tend to be a little aimless. They don't get anywhere in life because they have short attention spans. They set their short-term goals and they, jump from one thing to the next. And don't get me wrong, I'm not judging or criticizing. You do you, I've been there. I'm just trying to observe what I've noticed over my 48 years on this planet. Now, sometimes an otherwise aimless individual has a profound encounter with the reality of death. Often this happens when someone close to them dies. It could be a family member, it could be a friend, a neighbor, or even a pet or a celebrity they admire, like Kobe Bryant or Mac Miller, Cameron Boyce, Takeoff, or Juice WRLD. To a lesser extent, it could even be the death of a fictional character like Dumbledore or Mufasa. Now, of course, a near-death experience, such as a car crash or a mass shooting at your school or a terrorist attack in your office building, can have a similar and often more profound effect. We generally call this an existential crisis. It causes someone to have a meaningful reflection on the reality of death, which causes them to think about, what actually matters in life and what doesn't. In some cases, this existential reflection on death causes them to set course, to set goals and principles in their life that begin to govern how they live their life. Now, different philosophers use different words to describe this. Some call it an existential purpose. Others call it a vocation, which is a Latin word for calling. So a vocation is something that you are called to do. Japanese philosophers use this word ikigai, which is something that stands at the intersection of what you're good at, what you're passionate about, what the world around you needs to be done. Indian philosophers use the word swadharma, which is a dharma that the world needs to be done, which you have particular skill, talent, gifts, and passion for doing. For some folks, discerning their existential purpose, or vocation, or ikigai, or swadharma, or whatever you want to call it, for some folks, it's easy to discern what their existential purpose is. Maybe they're a victim of trauma, so they devote their life to helping others who are trauma survivors. Maybe they take great joy from healing and comforting people who are ill, so they become a doctor or a nurse or a psychologist. For other folks, it takes time and life experience to figure out what their existential purpose or calling or vocation is. Regardless, one thing is clear to me. If you truly figure out what your existential purpose in life is, it has a significant impact on the major decisions that you make in life. Using your college years to try and figure out what that is wise. As I've emphasized many times before, philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect by cultivating a desire for truth, wisdom, and justice through inspiration. The intellect is the part of the human person that makes decisions. And when we have meaningful discourse about the reality of death, we begin to realize what is actually important to us in life and what isn't. What begins as an existential crisis can evolve into an existential discernment, a discernment of what your existential purpose is. Why are you here? What makes your life meaningful? Regardless of what name we give to it, vocation, calling, ikigai, swadharma, or something else, that existential purpose sits at what we might call the heart of our systematic philosophy diagram. Like everything else in the diagram, it changes throughout the course of our lives, but it changes far less than our emotions and states of mind, etc. So that's the big picture of chapter 4, Setting Course. Now I want to zoom back in a little bit. Now in the first half of this chapter, we talked about this kid named Siddhartha Gautama. And he had a profound existential crisis when he was about 20 years old or so. He was surrounded by people who were suffering, and there didn't seem to be any logic or reason or justification as to why some people had lives filled with suffering and others had lives of privilege, wealth, and opportunity. He felt like nothing mattered in life, so he got depressed and he sat under a tree. In other words, he felt empty and aimless because he didn't have an existential purpose, a raison d'etre, or a reason for being. But through philosophy, he discovered his existential purpose. Now his logic went something like this. Step 1, suffering is bad. Step 2, alleviating suffering is good. Step 3, if you spend this moment right now alleviating someone else's suffering, then this moment right now becomes meaningful, purposeful, significant, and worthwhile. Step 4, repeat step 3. The more moments you spend doing something meaningful, the more meaningful your life becomes. What I want to do now is dive into 3 different but closely related philosophical insights from the Buddha. First, let's zoom out from our diagram of systematic philosophy. Next, we're going to shift our focus and zoom in on 3 aspects of the Buddha's teaching: anthropology, ontology, and epistemology. As we learned in chapter 1, anthropology is the branch of philosophy that asks, what does it mean to be human? Another way to ask this question is, who am I? Or what's the nature of the self? Now here, we'll look at what's usually called the Buddha's doctrine of anAtman, or no self. As we'll see, Buddha gives us a radically different way to understand what we mean by the words birth and death. At the exact same time, I want to zoom in on the Buddha's ontology. As we learned in chapter 1, ontology is the branch of philosophy that investigates the meaning of the word being. What does it mean for something to be or to exist? Here too, the Buddha gives us a lot to think about. We'll look at what's referred to as the Buddhist doctrine of pratityasamutpada, which we can loosely translate it as the doctrine of mutual arising. At the exact same time, we're also going to focus on the Buddha's epistemology. As we learned in chapter 2, epistemology is the branch of philosophy that focuses on the nature of knowing. How do we know what we know? How does knowledge and perception actually work? Now, why am I going to teach all of these 3 complex doctrines at the exact same time? The reason is you really can't separate them. To understand one, you have to understand all 3. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. What I'm about to teach is complex and difficult. I'm going to move step by step and try to lead you towards understanding using the same process that the Buddha used. But in order to follow it, you'll need to pay close attention. If you get confused along the way, don't sweat it. Confusion is normal and an essential stage in learning something new. Just keep taking notes, following along, and the light bulb will eventually come on for you if you remain attentive. So if you need a mental break, then now would be a good time to hit the pause button and come back when you're ready. It's a good time to stretch too. Siddhartha Gautama, as I mentioned before, lived around 500 BCE. About 700 years later, this brilliant philosopher and poet called Asvaghosa wrote a long poem about the Buddha's life and teachings. Now this poem is called the Buddhacarita. I mention it because most of what I'm about to teach you comes from that poem. In Canto 3 of that poem, Asvaghosa tells the same basic story that I told in the previous video. Siddhartha grew up in a privileged and sheltered environment. One day, as an adult, he left his palace. In Asvaghosa's version, Siddhartha was a passenger in a chariot. We'll come back to that much later in this philosophical quest. Now, when he leaves this palace in his chariot, he sees an old person, then a person with disability, and then a group of mourners at a funeral. As a result, he gets depressed. He has an existential crisis, and he sits under a tree for about 2 weeks without eating. In Canto 14, Asvaghosa walks us through, logically, carefully, meticulously, through Siddhartha's thought process as he was sitting under that tree. Now, for context, don't forget what we said earlier. Suffering is bad. Alleviating suffering is good. So Siddhartha's next question is, what causes suffering? If we can figure out the cause of suffering, then we can remove the cause. Sometimes the cause is super obvious. Let's say this person is suffering because they're starving. They're starving because they don't have food. Give them food. Suffering is removed. Easy. Or this person is hurt. They're suffering from wounds or disease. Treat the wounds, heal the disease, suffering is removed. But sometimes suffering runs deeper and is more psychological and philosophical, like nihilistic depression and existential angst or anxiety. So let's try and trace the cause of those kinds of suffering. With that in mind, let's go back to Classroom Brad from 2022. I've added some slightly better graphics with references to specific verses in Asvaghosa's Buddhacarita, which mostly line up what I was teaching. I add that in case anyone wants to go back and read that beautiful poem, which I'm happy to supply. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper into Buddha. So he had a little bit more realization than just this, although this is a good realization, isn't it? The word Buddha, should start there, I guess. So Buddhi means intellect. What does the intellect do? Intellect is the part of the human person that makes decisions. The other day, when we were talking about phenomenology, we talked about that conscious I, and then there's the phenomenon. Where's the phenomenon? There's the thing itself. Good. There's the phenomenon. Where's the phenomenon? Yeah, up here, right? It's what we're conscious of. It's the object of the conscious mind. The object of the conscious mind. So when we're asleep or dreaming or imagining or daydreaming, then this is it, right? We're conscious of whatever's in our head, right? Whatever phenomenon, whatever's in our head, that's what we're conscious of. It doesn't necessarily have to correspond to something outside, right? Some sensual object out in the world. So sometimes there's a correspondence between these two, and sometimes there's not. Like when I talk about my keys are there and I don't see my keys. So the keys are there to be seen, but my conscious eye doesn't see the phenomena of the keys. Or when we saw the snake that wasn't there, there was a rope that was there, but a snake appeared in the mind as the object of consciousness. So sometimes there's a correlation between these two, and sometimes there's not, which was why we talked about it in Chapter 2, and the whole point of Chapter 2 was what? How do we know what we know? How do we know what we know? So how do we know whether what we're seeing in our head corresponds to what's out there in the world or not? And the answer to that is phenomenology, phenomenological method, that sort of thing. But now we're kind of talking a little bit more, we're moving a little bit more this direction, and Buddhi. The Buddhi is one more step. So now we've got 4 columns here. The Buddha, this word, comes from this word, which means the one who's fully awake, right? We had these different states of consciousness that we went through the chapter pod. What were those 4 states of consciousness? Yeah, enlightenment at the top, the ordinary waking state, and deep sleep. So enlightenment, that's the Buddhi, the Buddha state, Buddhahood or Buddha-ness.
It's a state of total awareness.
Buddha, which means the enlightened one. They're like the lights being turned on. This word enlightenment, actually, the light there is super important. The way that another philosopher named Shankara from the 8th century CE, Shankara explained it like this. If you've got an object there, like let's say the marker. The marker is there and you can see it, obviously. If there was no light in here at all, if all the lights were off and I moved it somewhere, it was completely black, no light from the windows or anything, it was completely black, then you would have no idea where I put it. The marker would still be there, right? It doesn't stop existing when the lights are off. Still there, you just can't see it when the lights are off. So you need some sort of light source in order to see that external thing. So you need light shining on the sensual object in order to create this phenomenon in our head, which in order to see it with our conscious mind. But like we said, sometimes you can see something can point to something, and you still don't see it. So it could be like, hey, look, your keys are right there, and you still don't see them, right? That example. Or sometimes, more abstractly, if someone's explaining something to you, especially a philosophical idea or something, they can explain it to you, but you still don't understand it, right? The lights don't come on, you don't get it, you don't see it, right? When you're in math class or something like that, you ever have something where like your math teacher's trying to explain something and you just don't get it?
I just don't get it.
And then all of a sudden something clicks and you get it?
I get it now.
What do you say when that happens?
Oh, I see.
The light bulb went on. Light bulb, right? Or you say, oh, I see now.
Oh, I see.
Now I see. So because the light bulb went on, so
Oh,
the light
I
bulb
see.
goes on and I see. So that light is like this light tier where you have a more profound understanding, an intellectual understanding, not just a rational understanding. Cool?
Oh, I see.
Okay, so let's get a little bit more to his rational understanding. He was concerned about suffering, so he's trying to follow logically. The first person he saw was an old woman, right? An old woman who was begging for food. She couldn't hear, she couldn't see, right? Begging for food. And then he saw a person who was sick or disabled. And then he saw mourners and was conscious of the reality of death. And he thought, okay, what's the cause of these things? Is there one thing that we can point to that is the cause of all three of these things? What's required for a death to happen? Life, right? So, and where does life come from? What's the beginning of life? Birth. So birth causes death, for sure. Birth sometimes causes sickness. Can't have sickness unless there's a birth, and old age if you're lucky, right? So old age, sickness, and death are caused by birth. Without a birth, there's none of these things, right? Then what is birth caused by? Sex? Yeah. Birth is caused by sex. Just look at that. It's like up there. Right? Birth is caused by sex. Causes sex. Sure? Yeah. Lust or desire, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, there are some more steps between desire and sex, right? I'm still working on those steps. But ultimately, it comes down to desire. If there's no desire, then there's not going to be any sex, right? And so what causes desire? Hormones, those sort of things. But on the most logical level, there's no rhyme or reason to my color scheme. Desire is caused by sensuality. By sensuality, what do I mean? I don't mean like romance and candles and flowers and Chianti, but yeah, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, right? Your five senses. So we desire things that we see. We desire things that we hear. We desire things that we smell. So our desire comes from seeing things that we want, right? You ever had it where you're not particularly hungry, right? You're not like particularly hungry, and then all of a sudden you smell something that's like smells really, really good, and you're like, okay, now I'm hungry.
That's why I'm so hungry now.
Yeah, so that desire begins with our sensation, sensuality, and what causes our sensuality, we're getting more philosophical maybe, sensuality caused by our sense organs. So seeing is caused by our eyes, hearing caused by our ears, etc. But as we already shown, sometimes my eyes can see something like my keys. My keys might be there, but I don't see them, right? It could be like, we went through that the other day. This is like critically important. Change happens right here. Actually right there. What happens after this point? The light doesn't go into your brain. What happens at this point? How do the signals get there? So neurotransmitters, which travel along nerve cells, electrical signals travel along those nerve cells. In the case of the eye, they go to your visual cortex. Is it the back of the brain, like back here? Then what does your brain do? What does your visual cortex do? Basically, it recreates this, right? It recreates an image. Your brain constructs an image of the world that it sees out there, right? So sometimes something can be visible. Visible is different than seeing it. Or your math teacher explains something. It's like, well, I don't see it. I don't get it, right? It's still gettable. It's still seeable. You just haven't seen it yet, right? So just because something is visible doesn't mean that we see it, right? So there's got to be some sort of cognition behind it, so that our sense organs, right, we did this whole thing here, right? So just because there's some phenomenon, so there's some sensual object, and then we see that, which creates this phenomenon, although that phenomenon can also be created by our imagination or our memories or that sort of thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we see it, like if I'm distracted and I don't see my keys, or maybe I see a snake instead of the rope that's actually there. So this process here, these two, we can call cognition. Okay. So cognition, or a cognitive event. In order for there to be a cognition, there needs to be a cognition of something. So if you see something and you can't make sense of it, or you don't know what it is, then you say, what is that? Because you can't cognitively appraise it. So you're like, help me out. What is it? Mom or dad or teacher or whatever, explain it to me. If you're a kid and you point to something and you say, what is that? What kind of answer are you looking for? What do you expect your parents to, what kind of answer do you expect them to tell you? You want them to give you a word or something, right? Tell me what's that thing called? What's the name of that thing? What is that thing? And then they say that's a dog, or that's a cat, or that's a Lotus or Lamborghini or something. They give you some word. So what are the things that we are cognitive of? So they can take the form of a visible image, something that we can see in our heads, like the snake that we see in our heads that's not actually there. We have an image of the snake in our head. We could have sounds too. Like I said the other day, like you can hear a sound in your head. You can hear your grandfather's voice maybe, or something like that, even though they're not around. You can hear that in your head, or a song that's a lullaby that your mom sang when you were a kid, or just a favorite song or whatever. You can have these sounds that are objects of your consciousness. So you can have feelings, emotions, all these kind of things can sort of be objects of our consciousness. But we also have names. So you could say names, and let's call these things forms. So we are conscious of names and forms. Okay? So in order for there to be a cognition, the sense organs create these phenomena, and the phenomenon is always either a name or form. Form is something like a visual image, or a sound, or a feeling, or a smell. Whenever I think of my grandfather, I think of the way he smelled. Like, I didn't know him that well because he died when I was very young. But I remember going to his house and going to his room, and there was a smell there, I mean, he was old. But that smell is very vivid in my mind. Even more than his face, actually. I remember his smell more than I remember his face. So, names and forms. And these names and forms are the objects of our conscious mind. So that brings us around to this conscious I. Conscious I is always conscious of phenomena, which are always in the form of names or forms. And so these phenomena are perceived by the conscious I. Remember back to those states of consciousness. In the waking states, right, we've got cognitive I, cognitive of phenomena which correspond to things in the outside world. Dream states, this part's happening, but there's not necessarily any correspondence to thing in the outside world, right? Cognition's happening here, but without correspondence. Or also when we see a snake, when there's actually just a rope, or when I don't see my keys, etc. So this is happening. We call that the dream state. So you don't have to be asleep for the dream state to happen, right? You just have to be distracted or something like that. But then there's another state. So what's the other state? So what characterizes deep sleep? So this isn't happening. There's no conscious I. You're literally unconscious, right? Or in a coma, or you're out of it. There's nothing going on here. So
there's nothing going on in his stupid little head.
So in order for the conscious I to manifest or to become visible, then there needs to be something of which it is conscious, right? The conscious I must be conscious of something. That's definitely something you should write down. The conscious I must be conscious of something. What is it conscious of? Yeah, phenomena, names and forms, right? Where do those names and forms exist? How do they exist? What's the nature of their existence? How do they exist? Where do they exist? Where do phenomena exist? Up here. There's the thing itself. Good. there's the phenomenon, right? Phenomena exist up here. Where are they created? They're created by the mind, right? So phenomena exist only as an object of consciousness, and the conscious I only becomes manifest when it's conscious of something. Follow? This is a big significant thing that we're doing right here. Right? So the Buddha, when he's trying to trace the logical cause of old age, sickness, and death, he's trying to trace the cause of suffering, or he's trying to trace the cause of everything. And he arrives here, right? So old age, sickness, and death are caused by birth, which is caused by sex, which is caused by desire, which is caused by sensuality, which is caused by sense organs, which produce phenomena in our head or correlate to phenomena in our head. But those phenomena in our head are created by our head, created by our conscious mind, sometimes because they correlate to things in the outside world when we're in the waking state, and sometimes not, right? When we're dreaming or we're imagining things. So in either case, they're still creations of the mind, either creations that are caused in some sense by the sense organs, hopefully, if we're awake and alert and paying attention, or not. And in either case, their existence depends on the conscious I. They don't exist when you're not thinking of them. My keys exist whether we're looking at them or not. But they only become a phenomenon when you look at them. It only becomes an object of conscious mind when you're looking at them or thinking of them, right? So just because the sensual thing exists doesn't mean that it's a phenomenon. It only becomes a phenomenon when it becomes an object of the conscious mind. Make sense?
Yeah, totally. That makes sense.
So where do you go from here? We've arrived at a loop, right? This is caused by this, 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 which is caused by this. So we've arrived at a circle. If you've ever seen Zen Buddhist monks, they kind of draw circles. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form, or sunyata in Sanskrit, this emptiness of this process. So the conscious I, this ego, what we call ego, who am I at any given moment, depends on the phenomena that I'm aware of, what I'm conscious of. This is who I am. I, psychologically, philosophically, I am the one that is conscious of this thing at this moment, which only exists as an object of my consciousness. This is it, right? Some other philosophers, some other philosophies said that behind this, behind all of this, there's another self. And that self is who I am really, right? What does the word real mean? Are we using the word real in this class? Unchanging, right? So who is this real I? Will the real Slim Shady please stand up? Who is the real I, the real self, that unchanging self? But we already said, I'm constantly changing all the time. So this idea that there's some sort of self which is unchanging, that's the same from beginning to end, that you're always the same self from beginning to end, right? Even though who you are at any given moment is always subject to change, right? So this is a common philosophy. Buddha said, here's what the Buddha said. I'm paraphrasing. The Buddha said the hypothesis of self is logically unnecessary. The doctrine is known as the doctrine of anAtman. Anatman, no self. An meaning no, and Atman meaning self, but it's really sort of this bigger, unchanging, real, unchanging self. So there's this I that's constantly changing every moment. Anytime we're conscious of something, that's a different conscious I, right? But then the Atman is that unchanging, real self that persists throughout all of those moments of change. And Buddha didn't say, well, you can't disprove that, right? Buddha didn't say. What he really said was that this self is not logically necessary, right? You could believe it or not believe it, but it's a matter of belief. It's not a matter of logic. Make sense? Solid? Questions? Confusion? Thoughts? Got it? Cool. Okay. I know that was extremely confusing and probably pretty frustrating for some folks. So let me review a few points and try to add some clarity. Let's start at this absolutely key point where something very significant happens. To make it a little bit easier, I'm going to focus on vision, but the same points that I'm going to make apply to the other senses like hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling. When light enters our eyes, the rods and cones in our eyeballs convert that light energy into sense data. This is super significant. I can't overemphasize how significant this is. It's often called the cut. Light stops in our eyeballs. It doesn't get to our brain, right? Instead, the optic nerve sends electrical impulses to our visual cortex, which is kind of like a data processing computer that takes all of that data and creates, key term, a mental image. I heard this one philosopher, a tenured Duke professor, describe it like this. This is just an allegory, but I think it's pretty helpful. Let's imagine that there's a movie theater inside of your brain. Now you could think about your visual cortex as sort of like the movie screen, and your auditory cortex would be the speakers. And the conscious I, or ego, is like this tiny little you sitting in a chair alone in this movie theater. Now, that little you sitting in the chair watching the movie thinks that the images it's watching and the sounds that it's hearing are coming straight from the outside world, but they're not. The images and sounds and smells and sensations are actually created by the brain. Now, when everything is working properly, then what that little ego sees, hears, and smells does correspond to the sensible objects out there in the world. We've been calling this the waking state. Now, sometimes when we're asleep, the movies keep playing, even though our eyes are closed.
All right, what's on tonight, Dream Production?
We call those dreams. But it's important to remember two things. First, those dreams are created by our mind. Second, the same exact thing is also happening when we're awake. Now, what does all this have to do with Buddhist philosophy? Well, the Buddha pointed out a couple of important things. First, the conscious I, the little dude in the chair, is necessarily conscious of something. It can't be conscious unless there's something to be conscious of. If there's nothing to be conscious of, then it will create it. Why does that matter? Well, it means that the conscious I is ontologically dependent upon phenomena. Big words. Second, the phenomena of which the conscious I is conscious are creations of that conscious I. They only exist as objects of the conscious mind. That means that the phenomena are ontologically dependent upon the conscious I. Taken together, that means that the conscious I, or ego, and the phenomena that it is conscious of are ontologically dependent upon one another. That's kind of a big deal. In Sanskrit, this is called the doctrine of pratityasamutpada, or mutual arising. So the next time someone says to you, that's just your subjective opinion, or let's look at this objectively, then you can explain to them that subject and object are mutually constitutive correlates that ontologically arise together and depend upon one another for their being. Mic drop. This means that there's an ontological codependence of mind and thought. Ontological codependence means that one can't exist without the other. They depend on one another for their existence. My mind is my ego. When I use the word I, this is what I'm referring to. I am a knower. But I can't be a knower unless I know something. So being a knower ontologically depends on knowledge. But that knowledge is not just something in my brain, it's a part of me. I am what I know. What I know is a part of me. To be a thinker means to have thoughts, but those thoughts are phenomena that are created by me. I can't be a dreamer unless I have a dream, but the dream is mine. It's me. I can't remember unless I remember some memory, but my memories are who I am. They're a part of me. The memories depend on the rememberer, and the rememberer can't remember without the memory, which again is me. But it also means that who I am at any given moment is constantly changing, because the nature of myself as a conscious perceiver ontologically depends upon the phenomena that I consciously perceive at any given moment. In the doctrine of anAtman, or no self, Buddha said that it's fine to believe that there's a real I, a self that I always am, a me that never changes. But his philosophy demonstrates that it is logically unnecessary. Today, there are Buddhists who believe in the self, and there are Buddhists who don't believe in the self. The Buddha argued that the hypothesis of an unchanging, enduring self is logically unnecessary. I can believe that there's a Brad that always is and forever the same, but the only thing we have evidence for is that Brad is a conscious perceiver that is in a constant state of change. In fact, Buddha follows the logic even one step further. Since I am in a constant state of change, since the conscious I is ontologically dependent upon the phenomena I perceive at any given moment, then I die and I am born again and again and again from moment to moment, from breath to breath. In other words, Buddha radically reinterprets the words birth and death. In the same way that a river changes from moment to moment, so too who I am changes as my stream of consciousness changes. In fact, the goal of Buddhist meditation is to be still enough to observe the cycle of birth and death that arises and passes with each moment and each breath. By radically but logically reinterpreting ontology, epistemology, anthropology, birth, and death, the Buddha helps us to clear out all that mental clutter and focus on what truly matters, which is who I am right here and right now. So to summarize, as Buddha explained, who I am is both the conscious perceiver and the phenomena that I perceive. These two mutually arise and ontologically depend upon one another. This means that the answer to the question, who am I, changes with every moment. Every moment, one Brad dies and another Brad is born. And I can give purpose and meaning to each and every moment by observing it, honoring it, appreciating it, being aware of it, and, whenever the opportunity arises, use it to alleviate suffering. The last thing I want to add is about enlightenment. Enlightenment, or Buddhahood, or Nirvana, is not some state that a person attains once and for all. Rather, it's a state of total awareness. It's a state of being fully attentive to the birth and death of the ego with each passing moment, and fully attentive to the sense data that's streaming in through our eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin. The phenomenal content of our conscious perception define who we are. And if we minimize the role that our ego plays in that process, then we become, in a very real way, identified with something infinitely larger than that lonely little dude sitting in the cave of the movie theater in our heads. Well, let's try and think about sex. I want to talk about the relationship between sex and death. What's the point of sex? And what's the point of reproduction? Because we're going to die, right? So intercourse creates life, it's procreative, it makes more life so that life can keep going because the life that's here is going to die. Straightforward, right? So then sex is a way to transcend death. Sex is a kind of genesis. It's a kind of creation, a procreation, a creation of a new being. Freud talks about the sex drive and the death drive, right? We have this drive for sex, which is to make sure that we have intercourse, which is to make sure that we procreate so that there's life after we die. And when we were talking about this in chapter 2, we talked about the unzipping and the rezipping. So you've got half of your DNA that gets passed on to the next generation or whatever. So it's not me, my kids aren't me, but they're not me. I mean, I'm fine, I can swim, but I'm certainly not going to win any swim races. On the one day that it really mattered, on the one day where the race actually counted, on that one day, I was the fastest swimmer. As are you, right? They can't become human without having been the fastest swimmer on that one day that really mattered. Sex is the creation, it's the genesis, it's the beginning. It begins with the fastest swimmer and then ends at death. So death is the end of all possibilities. Sex is the actualization of the first possibility. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not arguing against any of that, right? But nevertheless, biologically, there's a drive, like a hormonal drive, to reproduce, which is largely due to the fact that organisms die, isn't it? Or because it can make life meaningful. And part of the way it can make life meaningful is because there's a part of me that's here after I'm dead, something that's going to live on after me. I mean, I'm not arguing against you. I take all your points. So, yeah, so I'm not arguing against anything that you just said, right? Anything that either of you just said. But my point is simply that philosophy begins with a meaningful reflection on death, and that reflection on death is always going to be inextricably linked from a discussion about sex, right? That sex and death go hand in hand. In the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 3, right? Sex and death are taught at the same time. The sex and death are inextricably linked. Sex and death are both revealed at the same time. Genesis chapter 3, this is the first time that we're introduced in the text to the ideas of death and sex. And they both come at the same time. There's these two trees. One is the tree of life, and if you don't eat of the tree of life, then you die. And the other is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, philosophy and ethics. And once they eat of the tree of knowledge of good and bad, or ethics, once they learn about ethics, then they also recognize the ethical implications of sex. And then that also closes them off from the tree of life. So sex and death are usually directly accompanied with one another when we teach. Most cultures teach them together because they're bookends in this sort of way. Death of one, the beginning of another. So sex and death in religious philosophies and non-religious philosophies have always been inextricably linked. And I'm just trying to get us to think about it a little bit more scientifically, a little bit more biologically, and recognize that there's a deep psychological, biological, hormonal relationship between these two things. Sex is a way to transcend death by continuing one's DNA into the next generation. Okay, but isn't that just sex with more steps? But ultimately, what do we mean by sex? Do we mean the act of sex, or do we mean sperm entering egg? Facts? Yeah? Yeah. I'm not saying that the point of sex is that's not even what it says, right? Sex is a way to transcend death. I'm not saying that that's the whole entire purpose of sex. All right. Okay. I'm just saying that is a way to transcend death. Cool? Okay. Okay, let's tie everything together and put chapter 4 to bed. We started with Mac Miller's video called Self-Care and the Latin words that he carved in his coffin, memento mori, remember death. I gave the thesis statement of chapter 4, which is philosophy only begins with a meaningful reflection on the reality of death. Confronting the reality of death helps us to discover the possibilities that we have right now and the opportunities that we have right now to make life meaningful. Many people in our world today, especially young people, struggle with existential anxiety and depression that comes from a feeling that my life doesn't matter and nothing I'm going to do is going to make any difference. In this chapter, I've tried to offer 3 major ways to overcome that feeling. First, the Buddha helps us to see that life is a series of individual moments. If you make this moment meaningful by alleviating the suffering of others, by appreciating the beauty of this particular moment, and filling as many moments as we can with things that matter, then our life as a whole will be filled with meaning and purpose and significance of beauty. Or, like Pitbull said, feel this moment. Second, InterCourse. I'm going to die, but hopefully my kids continue to have a positive, meaningful impact on the world after I'm gone. True, it isn't me, but it's not exactly not me. Third, DisCourse. This is really about the last word of my definition of philosophy, which is philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect by cultivating a desire for truth, wisdom, and justice through inspiration. Like many philosophers before me, I tried to draw as close a comparison as I possibly could between InterCourse and DisCourse. In the same way that my genetic material can continue to have an impact in the world after my death, so too can my words. Maybe Marshall Mathers said it best in his song, "Sing for the moment." Seize the moment, try to freeze it and own it, squeeze it and hold it, because we consider these minutes golden. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirits live on through the lyrics that you hear in our songs, and we can sing with me, sing for the year, sing for the laughter, sing for the tear. Sing it with me, it's just for today. Maybe tomorrow, the good Lord will take you away. Lastly, as we learned from Derrida, our words communicate through passageways of space-time long after our death, to contexts that we can barely imagine. And the meaning of our words change beyond our control, in the same way that my kids will have an impact that is beyond my control. Gandhi's words were very inspirational during his lifetime, but they continue to inspire people today. Martin Luther King's speeches were very inspirational when he was alive, but they continue to inspire millions of humans today. Jesus was an inspirational person, and his words continue to inspire today. Socrates was inspirational, and his words continue to inspire today. Mac Miller was a beautiful soul and a gifted artist, and it's sad that he died so young. But his words continue to live on, and his music continues to inspire. All of these philosophers, Buddha, Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Derrida, and Mac Miller, have experienced the utmost possibility of the absolute impossibility. And yet, they transcend death because their words continue to inspire. Peace out. Seize the moment, try to freeze it and own it, squeeze it and hold it, because we consider these minutes golden. And maybe they'll admit it when I'm gone, just let our words. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirits live on through our words. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirits live on through the lyrics. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirits live on through the lyrics. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirits live on through the lyrics. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirits live on through our lyrics that you hear in our songs. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our lyrics live on. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirit live on through the words. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirit live on through these words. And maybe they'll admit it when we're gone, just let our spirits live on through the words. And we can sing